Rainbow Six Siege is almost 10 years old, meaning the game has seen a lot of changes. So in today's video, I'll be explaining every single major meta over Rainbow Six Siege's life as a game. To start out, we need to rewind to December 1st of 2015. This is the day that Siege would be pushed out to the general populace. At first, there were only 20 operators total, so establishing a meta was much more difficult. This, paired up with the fact that everyone was still learning the game, made a meta, so to speak, almost non-existent. Although, when the game would shift into its first season, Operation Black Ice, the meta would start to form. And that was the ACOG meta. The ACOG meta was very simple. ACOGs were brought in all of the strongest operators in the game, be it attackers and defenders. Back then as well, ADSing was faster across the board, and some people with broken abilities at the time had ACOGs on guns that were already very good. Bandit was a great example. He brings the MP7, but back then it had less recoil and an ACOG. And Bandit was meta because there was no other breach denial. Jaeger was even worse, and his ability was more broken than Bandit's, and his gun was better too. Later down the line, Ash rushing with her ACOG as well as Bucks made the ACOG an oppressive force when gone against it. All of that combined with a lack of real meta in the first place makes me say that if there was a meta at the start of the game, it would have something to do with ACOGs. That, however, wouldn't last all that long. Enter Operation Blood Orchid. Operation Blood Orchid came with many important and unbalanced changes. You had the introduction of the map Theme Park and 3 new operators. These operators being Ying, Lesion, and Ella. Ying at this point wasn't seen as good, but Lesion and Ella on the other hand were absolutely broken. Ella's gun had no recoil, 30 bullets, good damage, and a very high fire rate. This paired up with her having 4 mines on release and her being a 3-speed with a shield made Ella an every round pick. To this day, she's seen as one of the most broken defenders on release, although now she's a shell of her former self. With 2 strong trap operators being introduced in Operation Blood Orchid and having every 3-speed lose access to ACOGs, the ACOG meta was no more. However, at this point, people had been playing the game for over 2 years, so when that meta fell, there would quickly be a successor. Because of how good the 2 new trap operators were, and because of Frost and Kapkan also being decent, this made everyone constantly run traps and a lot of slowdown utility every single round. Attacking this was a nightmare, as a lot of the time all the defense had to do was bring a Jaeger and nobody could explode any traps on the other side of a doorway. Pair that up with the fact that Lesion mines were invisible on launch, and you can see why traps might be very useful and become the trap meta. Even though I've had a lot to say about the trap meta in particular, this meta was not nearly as unbalanced as the next meta in this video, which is the rush meta. Playing in a more fast-paced sort of playstyle was something players were always trying to do and normalize at the start of the game. That's just how FPS games work. However, there was one man that accelerated pushing fast to the masses at an alarming rate. That man was Bolo. Bolo, at an age younger than I am now, was very good at Rainbow Six Siege. What most people know as quick leaning today was actually invented by Bolo, at least partially when he coined the Bolo lean. Back then, you used to lean farther and faster, making you get fast and safe information while also making your hitbox harder to hit when you leaned. But just like that storm was coming, there was an even bigger storm coming by the name of Operation White Noise. Operation White Noise came with a lot of new additions to Team Rainbow. The first of which being the map that nobody likes, which is Tower. For the new operators, we got to have Vigil added to the defensive lineup, and Dokkaebi to the attackers. At first, both of these operators would seem balanced. Dokkaebi in specific was actually seen as pretty weak because of her hard-to-use loadout, but her potential would absolutely skyrocket by the next season, which was Operation Chimera. Operation Chimera introduced the extraction game mode, but more importantly, it introduced 2 attackers, Finka and Lion. Finka was seen as pretty weak on launch, especially compared to the absolute monster that Lion was. Lion was so strong that he, to this day, was the strongest attacker ever on release. He was also the only attacker that was banned in Pro League because every Pro League player petitioned for him to be quarantined from the scene. Not only did you get info with your scans, but your scans would physically outline a player in red, giving you a much easier kill and essentially giving you wall hacks. If you pair that up with his good gun, and with Dokkaebi calls, and with faster mechanics, and with a fast Bolo-inspired game style, you create the rush meta. The rush meta was scary for defenders, not only because you had no good counters, but also because of just how broken Lion was. There was also a culture shock to the pro scene because everyone was used to playing so slow that this fast-paced gameplay was a rude awakening that frustrated the community at large. It actually took Ubisoft over half a year to get Lion nerfed, which means that this fast-paced meta was around for much longer than people were at all comfortable with. It is the most attacker-sided meta in history. The same cannot be said for the next meta in this video, which is the information meta. This meta took place just one season after Operation Chimera, which is the Operation Parabellum. This operation would introduce two new defenders at the time, Maestro and Alibi. Alibi on launch wasn't seen as that good, but Maestro on the other hand was on a whole different level. He only had 2 cameras, but keep in mind, his LMG had an ACOG, less recoil and more accuracy when hip firing. You also couldn't melee his cameras to blind them back then, and overall, there were less things that could counter his cameras on the attack because there were just less operators and less gadgets. This made Maestro a must-pick for every round when you were on defense. Add that up with Echo receiving a second camera, the same exact season, Mira also having her Miras not countered by Ashe, Kali, or melees, and Valkyrie being just as broken as ever, and you get a defensive lineup consisting of nothing but information operators. Thus, this time period was called the information meta. The cool thing about this meta in particular that didn't make it so broken was that there were some actual notable counters to it. Counters like IQ and Twitch, who not only countered them well, but weren't really played up until this point, which made these operators more played and balanced than they ever were. It was one of the most fun and balanced metas to ever exist, but even then, was a meta nonetheless, which would be slowly outshadowed by time. What would outshadow it though, was the next meta, which was the utility meta. Now, unlike the last meta in this video, this meta was the most broken meta for the defense and almost completely ruined the game for most players. The utility meta was a complicated meta that was set off due to many important and distinct factors, the first of which being Jaeger. Jaeger at the time was much more broken than he is now, allowing him to be able to block 9 throwable devices at one time with all 3 ADSs stacked together, essentially keeping a deployable shield alive forever. In Operation Ember Rise, deployable shields were also reworked, making it to where you could see right through them. This turned them into the best secondary utility option for defenders overnight. But there was one more key factor that created the utility meta that we knew, and that was Goyo. Goyo at the launch of Operation Ember Rise only brought 3 of his gadget, but his gadget was on top of a deployable shield, and it wasn't just a pack that you would place down on a wall like we know now. This means that if you brought Goyo, you had access to 3 deployable shields by 1 operator. These deployable shields would also waste time and burn enemies. Pair this up with another deployable shield on any other operator as well, and pair those up with Mute, Jaeger, and Wamai, and there was 0 possible way for the attack to ever break all of the utility brought by any single defender. This made attacking impossible, and made Goyo a must-pick for every competitive and ranked lineup. There was just too much utility and utility protection by any given defense team for the attack to destroy, and the only way this was mediated was with Jaeger and Goyo both getting nerfed very heavily multiple times. There were also other factors like Flores coming out and other things as well, but this meta lasted for way too long. Now, this may have been the most broken meta in Siege history, but it certainly wasn't the one that made the most amount of players leave. That meta was the next meta on this list, which was the TDM meta. In this story, let's fast forward to Operation Shadow Legacy. Operation Shadow Legacy would bring a lot of important changes. The Thatcher rework, the Tachanka rework, the Chalet rework, Ping 2.0, map bans, and many other changes. It would also introduce Zero, but there's one change in this season that was even more influential than everything I've talked about so far, and that was the addition of the 1.5 and 2x scopes. These 2 scopes were amazing because they had absolutely no downsides. They were just zoomed in enough to where you could take any long-range gunfight and just zoomed out enough to where you could take any close-range gunfight. The crosshairs on these guns weren't too invasive, meaning that you had a lot of scope glass space and you can see a lot of people, and these scopes didn't take away too much of your peripheral vision either. There was absolutely nothing wrong with these scopes, which was bad, because every other scope in the game had at least one thing wrong with it. Because these scopes were so good, it made it to where if these scopes were brought on by any operator, that operator would be played more, and it didn't matter if that operator had terrible utility. Let's take into account Alibi, Warden, and Oryx, for example. These 3 operators on the defense were terrible back then, and even to this day, are still not that good. But the second that all 3 of these operators gained access to the 1.5 times scopes on their SMGs, they became the most played operators overnight. Warden had over a 90% pick rate for a few seasons. Oryx and Alibi also had very high pick rates. There were some attackers that had this issue as well, but anytime Ubisoft wanted to balance an operator, instead of actually fixing the issue that made them bad in the first place, they would just give them a 1.5 times scope to make them played. This made the game extremely unbalanced, and because the game became more about having gunfights and less about utility, people would just run around and kill people instead of trying to plant/defuse the bomb. You kind of played the game more like a team deathmatch, which is why the name of the meta is a TDM meta. This meta would last for years. and would eventually lead to the next meta that's inside of the TDM meta, which is the LMG meta. The LMG meta was brought on by one important change, and that was the nerf to Zophia's AR recoil. When Zophia's AR got nerfed recoil, before it got its recoil eventually reduced to what we know today, Zophia's AR was almost completely unusable because of its recoil. This made most players stick to Zophia's LMG instead, and when people started to use Zophia's LMG, they realized how good LMGs were in the first place. This made people start to run LMGs on not only Zophia, but on operators like Finka as well, until eventually every single fragging team had 2 LMGs for everybody that was playing a fragging operator. If you pair this up with Ashe not having an ACOG on her R4C and being pretty bad at the time, you now understand why the LMG meta existed in the first place. LMGs were bad for the defense because if somebody is just spamming an LMG at you with no recoil and no movement debuff like we have now, there's not much you can really do, as they can just keep pre-firing every common angle that you could be sitting on and tap you before you're even able to see them. It was very unfair to defenders, which is why the LMGs were meta for so long. But when the 1.5 times scope was taken out of the game, just a few moments later, shields were reworked. Which brings me into my next meta, which is the shield meta. Shields for most of Siege's lifetime were pretty bad. A lot of the times they were easy to counter, and if you had any coordinated defensive lineup, you would be able to get around shields. To mitigate this, Ubisoft wanted to buff shields and make them more impactful while also not making them too lethal. But they absolutely failed by doing this, not because they were still weak, but because they were way too strong. Instead of Blitz being the only person that could run with his shield in front of his face, they made it to where every shield on every operator could also do this. They made it to where you could reload behind your shield, and you could throw utility behind your shield too, essentially taking away any sort of risk for any sort of shield player. They also made it to where shields didn't melee down people anymore, and they just pushed people around. But when you just push somebody around after meleeing them, all you have to do is melee them a second time for them to die. Meleeing also didn't expose your head anymore like it did in the past, meaning that meleeing was safer, or you could just ADS and shoot people when you downed them, making it to where you could kill people from a distance after meleeing them, and it was less risky. This essentially took away any downsides that shields had, which made everybody run at least a Monty or a Blitz, if not both, every single round in Ranked and in Pro League. Shields were the most banned attackers in Pro League and in Ranked as well during this time, and everybody was complaining about how bad shields were because even the highest level of players, Pro League players, had absolutely zero way to counter shields. Because that's just the thing. There was no counter. Out of every meta we've talked about in this video, this was the most uncounterable meta ever to exist. But luckily, unlike the other metas, Ubisoft was pretty quick to respond, only allowing the shield meta to go on for a few seasons before it eventually got nerfed to what it is now. Essentially, you have the same thing, but melee priority is given to every operator that isn't a shield operator, meaning that if you get meleeed by a shield while you melee that shield, you will always be the one that gets the melee off first. They also made it to where, when you melee a shield over and over and over again, you actually make the shield go farther and farther and farther, and they can't shoot you or melee you back in this animation. You also don't have to wait for the shield reset animation to happen anytime you melee somebody, meaning that you can continuously melee them the fastest that you can press your melee button, making it to where shields are still easy to play, but you have to be coordinated with a team to play them, which is what I think shields should be in the first place, which is why I think they're balanced now. But back then, they were not balanced at all. And from the shield meta, we are at the current day. Now, what is the meta currently right now? To be honest, there isn't really much of a concrete meta. Most Pro League players aren't really complaining about anything in particular, and the new season came out only a few weeks ago. So to say that there's a hard meta right now would be unfair of me to say. I guess you could say there's an ACOG meta because defenders are bringing ACOGs, but even that's a stretch. And I think Siege is in one of the more balanced states it's ever been in its lifetime. But that's it for today's video. My name is Alka. Check out this next video. Check out my Twitch if you like live streams, and I'll see you there.